says Dismantling Jordan Peterson. I want to talk about fiction. Now? Okay, good. All right. Today, I want to teach you how to write fiction. I am going to be reading a little bit of James Joyce's Ulysses to you. Everyone should be familiar with it, I think. We're just going to read a few very short passages, paragraph like that. And then I'm going to read you from my 877-page novel, Rossetti, The Story of the Middleweight. When I'm talking about Ulysses, you can be going on Kindle and downloading Rossetti, The Story of the Middleweight. You're going to read I'm going to read the beginning of it to you. You read inside free. Okay, I'm going to read the beginning of it to you, and in short, a few sentences, and then I'm going to explain it. And my idea is to teach you all I know about fiction, and to give you suggestions about how you can fully potentiate your fiction. All right, so let's start with Ulysses, which is a kind of fiction which is at the extreme opposite end of my fiction. Okay? I am a philosopher of fiction and poetry, and I have a theory of fiction, of the optimization of fiction. And that theory is that words in fiction have a very different use than words in poetry. I use words to do one thing: evoke a world. That's all. I want my words to evoke a world, an imaginary world, which is, as Melville said, must be truer than the non-fiction. Fiction must be truer than non-fiction, said Herbert Melville. And I second the emotion. Okay, it's an expression from the Supremes. All right, so I'm going to give you examples of my invisible fiction. In other words, my words serve one purpose: to evoke a world and disappear. The reader must not be focusing on the words, because that breaks the spell cast by the words. It breaks the evocation. See? All right, so in the first chapter of Ulysses, Buck Mulligan is admonishing Kinch. He calls him Kinch. I guess that's Stephen Dedalus. And he says to Stephen Dedalus, But to think of your mother begging you with her last breath to kneel down and pray for her, and you refused. There is something sinister in you. Okay. Stephen Dedalus is a Jesuit priest and who refused to kneel and pray for his mother as she was dying. And as a result of this, Stephen has dreams, bad dreams. What's going on? Okay. So look at this brilliant descriptive prose, brilliant prose. Silently in a dream, she had come to him after her death, her wasted body within its loose brown grave clothes, giving off an odor of wax and rosewood, her breath that had bent upon him, mute, reproachful, a faint odor of wetted ashes. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough of the Ulysses. You can remove that. Okay. So Ulysses is a showcase, a platform for the exposition of verbal genius. And this is obviously an example of verbal genius. I was fascinated by it. I thought, oh, I'm going to have a ball reading this. And I started reading more, and the two men start talking about buying milk, and the prattle between them about buying milk. It seems to go on and on and on. And it struck me as extremely effeminate until I couldn't stand it. Okay? Now, so Ulysses is not for everyone. Gone with the Wind sold 30 million books. Ulysses is in the 100 years since it was published. I don't know if it's exactly 100. Since it was published, has sold less than 1 million books. Okay? Even though it's widely lauded, the great literary masterpiece novel of the 20th century, James Joyce's Ulysses. So he had a philosophy of prose, and that was to use it to demonstrate his verbal genius. I mean, it's really more like poetic description than anything else. And I have a theory, as an aesthete and literary critic and philosopher, that he wrote Ulysses as he wrote it because he could not write poetry. And if you don't believe me, just read. Just go online and start reading his 10 most famous poems. I mean, they are atrocious, bad. Okay? So he could not write poetry. So this is his revenge on the world, I guess. This is how he expressed his poetic impulses, his desire to write poetry. He fulfilled this desire in the kind of passages I read to you. Okay? All right. I believe that more people will read Rossetti, The Story of a Middleweight, than any novel ever written. I'm confident they will. And I think you're going to agree with me when you hear a little of it. Now, why am I reading from my own novel to you? Okay? Because I want to show you how you can draw upon life experience to write a novel that is truer than nonfiction. I want to show you how to write invisible prose. See, you have tremendous advantages over the great Russians and Dickens, because they could not tell the whole truth. Okay? For example, Dickens was a social critic. He wrote about the sufferings of poor children in the poorhouse. And, his signature passage is a little boy asking for more food. Can I have another, sir? Okay. He could not write about the greatest social ill of his time, which was the baby farms, subsequently outlawed by Parliament after. All right, so you've all watched some of these upstairs, downstairs, series where the servants live downstairs. Notice that they have no children. These are young people. Where's their children? Okay. Well, this is what happened to their children in Victorian England. There's no place for them. They were unwelcome while they're upstairs. Okay. So they took them to a baby farm. That's what they call it. That's what they're called. Just Google baby farm. And they were greeted by the orphanage. It pretended to be an orphanage. They gave them what little money they could, and the orphanage promised to take wonderful care of them, and then, of course, destroy them. And, ghastly stuff. All right, see, today I could write about that. Dickens could write about it. Okay? See, I can write about everything now. And that's it. I'm trying, as a novelist, I don't want you to use your novel to show off, as James Joyce does. I want you to use your novel as a serious study of the world that we live in. Okay? I want it to be epiphanic. I want it to open people's eyes to things that they're not aware of. Thomas Mann said about the novel in the preface to Magic Money, he said that the novel must be light, enliven, and entertain. Second emotion. So let's get with it. And I will read you the beginning of chapter 1 of Rossetti, The Story of a Middleweight. Don't ask me how I got to Tampa. It's embarrassing. It's a long story that begins with my childhood and being Italian, D.G. Rossetti, and believing it meant something special. Here's the short version. I was at a CPA convention in Chicago. I had just passed the CPA exam and was working for a small firm in Cleveland. I met Gino Scaglione at the convention, a snowy-haired octogenarian. He said he had a small practice in Tampa and was dying of cancer, and he cared about his clients. He didn't want to sell his practice to me. He wanted someone to take it over. It could be the beginning of a lucrative practice for a young CPA like me. Besides, Tampa was an Italian city, and I would feel comfortable there. He had an ingenuous, warm-hearted manner that disarmed me. I flew down a couple weeks later and met the Toscanos, his most important client, who had a seafood restaurant on Tampa Bay. We looked at their computer-generated books. It impressed me that a mom-and-pop business could generate $300,000 in sales. Gino said they were paying him $2,000 a month, but he was failing and couldn't work much longer. He had other clients, and I would make more than my salary in no time. I wasn't enjoying my work in Cleveland. I felt like an intern and wasn't making diddly. I thought I heard opportunity knocking and flew down a month later. The Toscanos picked me up at the airport and drove me to their restaurant. They were in their 60s, frantic, almost hysterical. The IRS was there, poring over their records. The restaurant was a vast, sprawling affair on a causeway. It was packed and had to do $100,000 a month. I had been had. The Toscanos introduced me to the agent in charge of the audit. He asked for a meeting in my office. That would be Scaglioni's. That night, after the restaurant closed, Louis and Paulie Toscano and I sat at a table drinking cafe con leche. They went on for an hour about opening 30 years before and never being audited. They thanked Gino for this. He had been doing their books and tax returns. Now I would be doing them. No thanks. They thought I was going to talk to the auditors and they were going to go away, all because they, the Toscanos, were patriots. They loved America and had always been very scrupulous about paying their taxes. I said I would find out what the IRS wanted to do. I asked who they had working the cash register. Grandmother was working the cash register. Okay. Let's pause there and talk about what I have accomplished in 2 pages. I have introduced my character, who we knew nothing about, of course, on the first page, except that his age and what his situation was, and by the end of the second page, I think that he is fully described, almost fully described. I mean, I don't think you'll find a novel that does this much in a short period of time. And at the same time, I have a narrative going. See, that is absolutely realistic, but witty. It's humorous. I mean, this is a story that's been told, a million times. See, the grandmother working the cash register. Where did this come from? Who is this? Who is this character presenting? It's me. Not now. Not now, of course. But me, just out of law school. I was a lawyer, I wasn't a CPA, but the same. These people were my clients. They did have a seafood restaurant at Tampa Bay. They did have an audit by the IRS. Same story. Okay, so I use this from my experience as a lawyer. I mean, these are real people. This is a real event. Okay? Don't worry, they've long since gone to their reward. You cannot. I'm going to interject law wherever it's appropriate. You can't libel a dead person, and nobody cares about this now. It's 100 years ago. It still happens today. In my hotel that night, I thought about flying back to Cleveland. I knew a couple firms that might give me a job. I had gotten good grades at Ohio State, worked some part-time accounting, and won a modest scholarship. I graduated without debt, and this impressed the old-timers who were used to seeing graduates owing $100,000. I even managed to save a little.
But I was too proud to go back to Cleveland. I was supposed to meet with Gino the next morning, but why? I thought I knew what his practice consisted of and wasn't interested. Better to start with a clean slate. No sleepless nights. I decided not to see him again. The next morning I sat in a cafe in Ybor City looking for a room in the classifieds. The cafe was full of old men speaking Spanish and Italian. A large cream-colored table in a nearby corner was reserved for the editor of the Ybor City newspaper. A plaque on the wall showed him as a white-haired man in a white suit and indicated he had been dead for years. The sound of Italian made me think of my childhood in Cleveland and my comical great-uncles, the Italian POWs, two brothers, patriots who ran for the British lines when they saw Rommel's panzers coming to rescue them, kicking up a cloud of sand. Viva Italia, viva il Duce, without us, take us to New York, per favore. I imagined them running with their hands raised. I thought of the Toscano's audit, first in 30 years, and my mind wandered to my work in Cleveland, the IRS finally catching up with abusive tax shelters. The IRS finally catching up with abusive tax shelters, clients at rest. I would refer the IRS agent to the cemetery. Okay, see that is brought to mind by the Toscanos saying this is their first audit in 30 years. So it took the IRS, they've been doing this for 30 years, just like back in the 50s when, the rich were supposed to pay 90%, they were supposed to pay up to 90%. They were taxed up to 90% of their income. And so they didn't pay, often they didn't pay anything because they engaged in these abusive tax shelters. Completely phony. As soon as the IRS got around to investigating them, they were set aside. They were invalidated by the IRS. But the rich man, taxpayer, by then he had died of old age. Okay, I mean, now where does this come from? Well, this is an actual experience. My brother Randy, who was auditor for the IRS for 20 years, it's an actual experience he had. And I remember him telling me that, this must be 20 years ago, telling me that in the year he was working, and the year before, the IRS only imprisoned 16 people in the whole country. Okay, so you see how I am drawing upon life experience to create a real world. It's absolutely realistic. And it's humorous. It's interesting. Okay? All right, so he's now... Oh, and by the way, these are real places. The Tropicana just closed. I'm thinking about reopening it myself. I mean, it breaks my heart. I mean, Google the Tropicana, La Tropicana Cafe in Ybor City on 7th Avenue. That's the Basin Street of Tampa, the Latin Quarter of Tampa, which is, not French, it's Cuban. Cuban cigar makers. Okay. All right, so you'll see this memorial table where the editor of the honorary mayor of Ybor City drank coffee for so many years. When he died, they set aside this cream-colored table as a memorial to him. They have a picture of it. You can go, well, you could. Somebody's got to reopen this icon. This would be a tragedy if they don't reopen it. God. I mean, I don't know how many mornings I spent in the Tropicana, drinking coffee, with Judge Wilson, the retired judge, and other friends. God, makes me want to cry. All right, so see, I'm putting this in my Tampa, in my life, and I'm basing the character on me. And, he's got my personality, see, which is a unique personality, a real personality. So he's sitting in the Tropicana, and he's thinking about, first thought in 30 years, and it makes him, think about the tax shelters, and referring the IRS to the cemetery. Okay, now, so he's lost in reverie here, and I continue. And then a wizened little Sicilian grandfather was talking Italian to me. "You are from Italy," he said. "I know from your walk." I told him La Storia Mia, abbreviated. He introduced me all around, then drove me to his sister's, who had an apartment on Tampa Bay. This became my new home, a garage apartment. The sister, Mrs. Cacciatore, lived in the ramshackle two-story frame attached to it, with her boarders. Beautiful vista of the bay the next morning, woken by rosy-fingered dawn, birds making a terrible racket in my window. I made myself a cup of coffee and looked out over the glowing waters. Now all I needed was a means of keeping body and soul together. I decided not to hurry, not again. I thought I'd look around a little. Okay. So see, now I have really started setting up my scene. We're just on the third, I think on the third page. No, I'm sorry. The fifth page. Oh, the sixth page. Wow. Okay. All right. But I hope I haven't lost your interest for a second. You can't do that. You can't lose the reader's interest. How do you keep the reader involved, interested? Plot. Okay. Plot. The novel must be a long story about the world. Ulysses doesn't use it to study as a study of the world, to explore the real world. Okay? What does he explore? I guess he explores himself and his language and. Okay, so when people see, I believe that the novel, the long narrative about the world, is in our DNA. I mean, we have been telling stories. We were telling stories in the caves, I'm sure, 50,000 years ago. Okay, so we use language. We have for 50,000 years. See, as long as we've used it, we don't know how long we've used it. But people, I think, the consensus, they keep moving it back. I think that there's some who believe that we've used it. I mean, scientists who believe we've used it that long, certainly for tens of thousands of years. So what do we use it for? We used it if we were going to do a lot of talking. There wasn't communication of vital information. If we were going to tell some kind of story, a long story. We used it to communicate, the story, to tell a story. Okay? And so I think when I hear somebody talking and I can't figure out what they're trying to say, it annoys the hell out of me and everybody else. We say, get to the point. We want to know what happened. See? So every word of my narrative tells you what's happening. And it's all relevant. Every word in my narrative is relevant to the story, the novel, which is, the exposition of this young man's personality, the exposition of the world he lives in, and we know by the title he's going to become a middleweight boxer. He doesn't know that. So we want to hear about how this happens, right? That's why we're reading. By now, I've set the scene, and he's found a place to live, and we want to know what's going to happen, don't we? Okay? Because we're interested in him, because he's been presented in a realistic, believable way, and we're concerned about him because he got bamboozled, and he's down here, on the other side of the country, and we're concerned about what's going to happen to him, aren't we? See? All right. So he said, I decided not to hurry, not again. I thought I'd look around a little. He's talking about looking around for a position, right? I spent the day in Ybor City, loafing and buying things for my apartment. I bought a sangria pitcher and spent hours in a giant cigar factory that had been converted into an antique mall, and bought some early 20th century orange crate art to put on the walls. It was the first week of January, luxurious, cool, sunny weather. I finished up around 5 by meandering, with shadows of evening falling. Sat on the terrace of a restaurant and smoked a cigar, which I only did on special occasions. I felt great, 1,000 pounds lighter. I realized that I had used Scaglione as an excuse to quit my job. I never took him seriously and wasn't surprised by what happened. Beyond that, I wanted to leave accounting. I had tried it and didn't like it. Too much of it was a variation on the Toscano theme. At the other end of the spectrum was Enron, hiding behind Arthur Andersen, the giant accounting firm, largest in the country, then taking the firm down with it. Perhaps I could get a job as a controller for a small company and move from there into management. A small band, he's sitting on the terrace of a cafe next to the sidewalk, right? A small band marched by, its brass flashing, followed by a train of revelers dressed in the brown khaki uniforms of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, 1898. I am a history buff of sorts, who always pauses to read historical markers. 7th Avenue had become a poor man's Bourbon Street. I imagined it full of bands and... That's not Bourbon Street, it should be Basin Street. I imagined it full of bands and marching soldiers, returning from the Spanish-American War, the crowds cheering, the water a few blocks away. In those days, people would stand on the roofs of cigar factories, watching for the ivory clipper ships to sail into Tampa Bay. It was, to sail into Port Tampa, laden with tobacco from Havana. I was lost in this reverie when I realized that a man was talking to me. He was asking me if I would watch his attaché case a minute. That's what he called it. He looked like the man boy in the old Philip Morris cigarette commercial who cries, "Call for Philip Morris." I said sure and began reading a La Gazzetta, read the entire section about locals getting married and belles attending local balls. A half hour passed, and the man did not return. I took the still attaché case and looked for him inside, walked through a cigar store, checked a wine bar, asked a couple waiters. No one had seen him. I thought I would leave it, identified someone who looked like the manager, but didn't like his looks, and returned to my table. Black outside. I drank another cup of coffee, tarried an hour, and left, taking a cab to my apartment. The next morning, I put a notice in the Lost and Found, stayed in my apartment a couple of days reading and hoping to get a call. I felt for the guy, knew how he must be feeling. I had done the same thing myself. I hoped he'd have the sense to check the Lost and Found. No calls. I bought an answering machine to free myself from the phone. The next day passed without calls or messages. Okay. So now, the hook should be firmly implanted in the reader. Okay? Now the reader wants to know what's inside the attaché case and what's going on here. But look at how much I've told you about this young CPA. This is a really serious, conscientious guy. and a really good guy. I mean, somebody else would have, opened it, hoping to find money and taken off. Okay. So watch what I do now. I began taking long walks and exploring the neighborhood. Mrs. Cacciatore's was just west of Bayshore, a 3 or 4 mile crescent with a continuous sidewalk, which, according to Guinness, was the world's longest continuous sidewalk. On evenings and weekends, it came alive with people jogging or roller skating or pushing perambulators. They lived in the Grand Bayshore mansions, or in the neighborhood that stretches for blocks behind them, Palmacia, home of Tampa society. In my walks, I discovered a trove of architectural curiosities, epitomes in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Oddly, one of the most curious was right next door to Mrs. Cacciatore's, a freshly painted Georgian colonial, austere and white. I found something a little sinister in the ostentation of its massive 3-story marble columns, set off by well-manicured grounds. It was hard to imagine an owner so wealthy he could invest a princely sum in this feature with no hope of recouping it when he sold the house. On the 5th day after obtaining the attaché case, I was sitting in a chair behind my apartment watching the sun set on the bay, night's gorgeous mansions, when the strange little man appeared beside me, startling me. He gave me a white envelope, turned on his heels, and vanished, swallowed up by the shadows as if by another dimension. Inside the envelope was an invitation embossed in gold to a party the following night given by a Mr. M. Pilar. I didn't know the name, but recognized the address as my next-door neighbor's. This gave me a chill. I had been tested. I gathered my thoughts. I wondered how much money was inside. Probably a lot. I was not going to a drug dealer's party. I went next door and knocked. A maid answered a moment later, a Latin woman. I didn't want to leave it with her and asked to see Mr. Pilar. He wasn't home. Was I the young man who lived next door? I was expected at the party. She didn't want to take the responsibility of the attaché case. Would I please bring it with me? End of chapter 1. I've never encountered a better first chapter in anywhere in world literature. This first chapter can almost stand as a short story. Look what I did after I talked to you. I continued to set the scene. Oh no, I have to back up further. The little man who he looked like the little man boy in the old Philip Morris cigarette commercial call for Philip Morris. Well, he was in the Tropicana, 3 or 4 days a week. And I recognized him from the old Philip Morris commercials. Okay. So, I imagine this novel being annotated with all these little notations here. Okay. So, what I do here is I really explain his character, and then I set the scene more, and I tell more about him, and then, you're waiting to find out the answer, the mystery of the attaché case, and bang, it's the strangest thing. It's something you would never guess, isn't it? The big house next door, they're responsible for leaving you with this attaché case. And here's the backstory, see, which gives it more richness. What went on here? Well, Mrs. Cacciatore has been living next door to the Pilars forever, okay? Old woman. And she has told the Pilars, and she has a dashing young CPA, unemployed CPA, living in her garage apartment, who just came from Cleveland. She knows all about me from, this happens in 2004. She knows my name, she's going online, she's talked to her brother, she's learned everything that I told him. Yeah? And so we know now that I really now set the scene, because now the Pilars are going to become a important piece of this novel, and see, this is a mystery now. See, I'm opening up. First, I opened up the mystery of the Relay case, okay? And I used it, to develop my character more. Right? Now we have a new mystery. I'll just read you a little bit of chapter 2. I felt that Pilar had made a fool of me, having me babysit his drug money. If he wanted it, he knew where it was. Around 9 the next evening, I was sitting in my apartment reading when someone knocked on the door. Probably Pilar, I thought, come for his money. I planned to express my relief that he had found my notice. If he asked me to the party, I would beg off. I opened the door and my heart stopped. A Latin faun with brown eyes of liquid crystal. Her smile dazzled me. She shook my hand, a teen angel, bubbling, giggling. I thought she'd break into a cheer. Why was she looking around the apartment? She was looking for the attaché case. I had hidden it. We exchanged introductions. She started moving around, looking. I noticed the concupiscible figure, the movement, thought of a fish cast ashore by the angler, wiggling, jumping, slithering. It was too much for me. She seemed to fill up my little apartment. And then I noticed the cascade of chestnut hair. Shave, shave, she cried. Can I see your clothes? My clothes? Then she was in the clothes closet. The attaché case wasn't there, so I let her rummage and went into the bathroom to shave. Where did you get these old man's clothes? They're Ivy League, I said. You can't wear any of this, I laughed. All right, I won't come. You can wear these jeans. What about the sports coat? I asked. I guess. Here it is. Ick. I hear her scurrying, searching. She'd never find it. How was I going to get it back to Pilar? The little stinker actually got under the bed and pulled it out. I heard it dragging. No, I cried, wiping my face with a towel and running out. She was kneeling beside it, open, stuffed with hundreds, her hands full. I had to shake the money loose, holding her slender wrists gently. What are you doing? I asked. It's hundreds of thousands. Let's spend it together. I laughed and shut the case. Does your father know you're here? He sent me. Then her cell was ringing and she started talking to a girl. A moment later, she said she had to run and would meet me at the party. Promised to come, she said. Sure, I said, and she was out the door. I sat down and tried to gather my thoughts. Ask me no more whither do stray the golden atoms of the day. For in pure love, heaven did prepare those powers to enrich your hair. That's a quote from Lord Lovelace, the great Elizabethan poet. All right. I'm the guy that told you that prose has to disappear. This is an exception. See? He quotes more Lovelace later. But see, this is necessary to the narrative because it helps me to develop his character. He's an aesthete. So what have I done? I've gone from low energy, from a meditative, contemplative first chapter, okay, to a burst of energy, okay, in the second chapter. And also, I've given you more content, and the content is that he's not getting away. He's not getting away from the Polars. The Polars, he's a fish on a hook, see? So, please, you've got Rossetti there. You can keep reading the beginning. That'd be great. And then let's talk about it. And talk about, fiction, writing fiction. And because I want you to write fiction, see? I want you to get excited by this and write your own fiction. You see the elements here. That's my personality. See? That character is me. Okay? So I get to express my personality, my humor, my knowledge. What am I doing? I'm exploring this home where I lived 34 years. And Bayshore Boulevard is the longest single continuous sidewalk in the world, or at least in the country. Whatever Guinness says, I don't know, but it's the longest in the country, at least. Bayshore. I've walked it many times. Very familiar, see? With everything in the novel, which you have to be. So you have to see how I've explained how I've shown you how I put my life into this novel, my life experiences. Okay? So these are the things that I want you to chew on now. See, if you have an interest in writing fiction, and again, please let me hear from you. Okay, Tech.